What happens when a wife travels 3,000 miles to find her missing husband, only to discover he's built a new life with another woman? Margaret Eliza Hartwell stood at the edge of Hangtown, clutching a faded daguerreotype against her chest like a prayer she'd forgotten how to say. The mining camp sprawled before her in the California afternoon, a chaos of canvas tents and ramshackle buildings that seemed to mock the orderly farmhouse she'd left behind in Missouri. 6 months of silence from Thomas. 6 months of staring at that photograph until his face became a ghost she carried in her pocket. The wagon driver who'd brought her from Sacramento had warned her about women who came west looking for lost husbands. Most don't find what they're hoping for, he'd said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. But Margaret had come anyway, driven by something fiercer than hope, something that felt more like drowning. The sun hung low over the Sierra foothills, casting long shadows between the miners' shacks and saloons. She could hear the distant sound of picks against stone, the eternal rhythm of men tearing gold from the earth. Thomas had written to her once about that sound, how it followed him into sleep, how it beat like a second heartbeat in his chest. She'd imagined herself here beside him, listening to that metallic percussion, sharing in the dream that had pulled him 3,000 miles from home. Instead, she stood alone among strangers, her traveling dress gray with trail dust, her hands trembling despite the warmth of the dying day. A woman emerged from one of the larger cabins, shaking out a rag rug with practiced efficiency. She was perhaps 40, with steel gray hair pinned severely back and the weathered complexion of someone who'd learned to make do without softness. Margaret approached her with careful steps, as if the ground itself might give way beneath the weight of what she needed to know. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "I'm looking for Thomas Hartwell. He's been mining here well, I believe he's been here for some time." The woman's hand stilled on the rug. She studied Margaret with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Yet something flickered there, a recognition that made Margaret's chest tighten. "Thomas Hartwell," the woman repeated slowly, as if tasting the name for poison. "You'd be his wife then." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. The woman knew. Somehow, impossibly, this stranger knew not just Thomas, but knew of her, knew what she was to him, had been to him. "Yes," Margaret whispered. "I am." The woman set down the rug and wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture that seemed to buy her time to choose her words. "He's got a claim up on Bear Creek," she said finally, "about 2 miles north of here. But miss," she paused, her mouth working around something difficult, "you might want to prepare yourself. Men change out here. The gold fever, it changes things." Margaret's fingers tightened on the photograph. "What do you mean?" But the woman had already turned away, disappearing back into her cabin as if she'd said too much. Margaret stood in the settling dust, feeling the weight of unspoken warnings press down on her like the approaching dusk. She thought of Thomas as she'd last seen him, kissing her goodbye on the front porch of their Missouri farmhouse, promising to send for her once he'd struck it rich. His eyes had been bright with dreams then, full of visions of the life they'd built together with California gold. Now those same eyes stared back at her from the daguerreotype, frozen in time, innocent of whatever transformation the woman's words had implied. She found lodging for the night at a boarding house that charged twice what she'd paid in civilized country for half the comfort. The proprietress, a thin woman with suspicious eyes, took Margaret's money without comment, but studied her as if she were a curiosity, a specimen of something that didn't belong in this harsh landscape. That night, Margaret lay awake on a straw mattress, listening to the sounds of the camp settling around her. Drunken laughter from the saloons, the occasional gunshot, the endless whisper of wind through canvas and pine. Somewhere in this wilderness, Thomas was sleeping under the same stars. Tomorrow she would see him again. Tomorrow everything would be made right. The morning came pale and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Margaret rose before dawn, braided her hair with care, and put on her best remaining dress, the blue one Thomas had always admired. She walked north from town as the woman had directed, following a creek that ran silver and clear between the hills. The path was rough, marked by wagon ruts and the scattered debris of mining operations. Everywhere she looked, the earth had been torn open, scarred by the desperate hunger of men seeking fortune in stone and dirt. After an hour of walking, she heard voices ahead, the sound of men at work. She followed the noise up a ridge and found herself looking down into a small valley where three men labored over a sluice box, washing gravel in the eternal search for flakes of gold. One of them looked up at her approach, shading his eyes against the morning sun. He was younger than Thomas, with a beard the color of dried grass and clothes that had seen too many days without washing. "Ma'am," he called out, straightening from his work. "You lost?" "I'm looking for Thomas Hartwell," Margaret replied, picking her way carefully down the slope. "I was told he has a claim near here." The young miner exchanged glances with his companions, and Margaret felt that same flicker of recognition she'd seen in the woman's eyes the day before. "Tom's place is just over that next ridge," he said, pointing east. "But ma'am, you might want to—" He trailed off, seeming to wrestle with something he couldn't quite bring himself to say. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Please, I've come a very long way." The miner removed his hat and ran grimy fingers through his hair. "Tom's a good man, ma'am. Don't let nobody tell you different. But the thing is—" He looked at his partners as if seeking permission, then back at Margaret. "He ain't alone up there. Got himself a woman living with him. Indian gal named Ayana. Been together the better part of a year now." The words struck Margaret like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. She stood frozen on the hillside, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. The photograph in her pocket seemed to burn against her ribs. "Living with him?" she repeated numbly. "Yes, ma'am. They got a cabin built proper, garden growing out back. Looks like, looks like they mean to stay." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten to spill over. When she opened them again, the landscape seemed different somehow, sharper and more hostile. The mountains that had looked majestic from a distance now loomed over her like accusers. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you for telling me." She turned and walked away, leaving the miners standing awkwardly by their sluice, uncertain whether they'd done kindness or cruelty. Margaret climbed the ridge on unsteady legs, driven by a need to see for herself, to make real what her mind refused to accept. At the crest of the hill, she looked down into a narrow valley where a log cabin sat beside a creek, smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. A garden plot stretched out behind it, neat rows of vegetables growing in the rich bottomland. It looked exactly like what the miner had said, a home where people meant to stay. As she watched, the cabin door opened and Thomas emerged, carrying an armload of firewood. Even at this distance, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with careful economy. He looked older, his hair longer than he'd ever worn it in Missouri, his frame leaner from hard work and mountain living. He stacked the wood beside the door and turned back toward the cabin, and Margaret saw his face clearly for the first time in 6 months. He was smiling. The door opened again, and a woman appeared. She was young, perhaps 20, with long black hair that caught the morning light like silk. Her dress was simple but clean, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone at home in her body and her place. She said something to Thomas, too quietly for Margaret to hear across the distance, and he laughed. The sound carried up the hillside like a knife to Margaret's heart. It was a laugh she remembered, the one he'd saved for moments of pure happiness, the one she'd thought belonged only to her. The woman, Ayana, the miner had called her, reached up and brushed something from Thomas's cheek with an intimacy that spoke of countless such small gestures. He caught her hand and kissed her palm, a tender movement that made Margaret's chest ache with recognition. She had seen Thomas make that same gesture 100 times, felt the warmth of his lips against her own palm in the early days of their marriage. Now he gave it to another with the same reverence, the same gentle devotion that had once been hers alone. Margaret sank to her knees in the tall grass, clutching the daguerreotype so tightly its edges cut into her palm. She had prepared herself for many possibilities during the long journey west. She had imagined finding Thomas dead, or injured, or struggling with failure and shame. She had not prepared herself for this. Finding him not just alive but happy, not just surviving but thriving, not just living but loving. The completeness of his new life struck her like a physical blow. This was not a man marking time until he could return to his wife. This was a man who had found his true home. The tears came then, harsh and bitter, falling into the mountain grass like prayers to a god who had stopped listening. She thought of the farmhouse in Missouri, empty now except for dust and memories. She thought of the neighbors who had watched her pack the wagon with pity in their eyes, certain she was chasing a ghost. She thought of the money she'd spent, the risks she'd taken, the faith she'd carried across a continent like a sacred flame. All of it meaningless now, ashes scattered on the mountain wind. Below in the valley, Thomas and Ayanna had gone back inside their cabin, leaving only the smoke from their chimney to mark their presence. Margaret sat alone on the hillside, feeling the weight of 3,000 miles and 6 months of silence pressing down on her like stones. The photograph in her hand seemed to mock her now, its frozen image of happiness, a relic from a life that no longer existed. She had come west to reclaim her husband and found instead the grave of her marriage. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the valley floor. Margaret rose slowly, her knees stiff from kneeling in the grass, and walked back down the ridge toward town. Each step took her further from the life she'd thought she was coming to claim, and closer to a future she couldn't yet imagine. The miners looked up as she passed, but none spoke. What was there to say to a woman walking away from her own heart? That evening found Margaret sitting on the steps of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the California hills. The proprietress emerged from inside, carrying a cup of coffee that steamed in the cooling air. "Rough day," she observed, settling beside Margaret on the wooden steps. It wasn't a question. "I found him," Margaret said simply. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant. "And?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the light fade from gold to red to purple across the western sky. "And he's exactly where he wants to be." The proprietress nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected. "Men come west for all kinds of reasons," she said. "Some running toward something, some running away. The lucky ones find what they're looking for. And the wives they leave behind? That depends on what they're made of." Margaret felt the weight of those words settle around her shoulders like a shawl. What was she made of? For 26 years, she'd defined herself as Thomas Hartwell's wife, as half of a pair that made sense only in combination. Now she sat alone in a mining camp 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, forced to discover what remained when that identity was stripped away. The stars emerged one by one above the Sierra peaks, cold and distant and beautiful. Margaret thought of Ayanna in the cabin with Thomas, perhaps cooking dinner over their fire, perhaps sitting beside him as he planned tomorrow's work. She thought of the way the young woman had touched his face, casual and sure, marked by the kind of intimacy that came only from shared days and nights, from building a life together, stick by stick and stone by stone. A part of her wanted to hate the woman, to rage against the theft of what had been hers by right and law and sacred promise. But sitting under the star-drunk sky, Margaret found she couldn't summon that anger. Ayanna had loved a man who was free to be loved, who had come to her unencumbered by the weight of obligation or duty. She had built a home with someone who chose to be there, not someone bound by vows spoken in another lifetime, in another world. The proprietress finished her coffee and stood to go inside. "Room's yours as long as you need it," she said. "No judgment here about what comes next." Margaret nodded, grateful for the kindness in words that asked no questions and offered no advice. She sat alone on the steps, feeling the night air cool against her skin, listening to the distant sounds of the camp settling into evening. Somewhere in the darkness, Thomas was sleeping beside his new love, peaceful in his chosen life. And here she was, suspended between the woman she'd been and whoever she might become, learning to breathe in the thin mountain air of absolute freedom. The photograph still rested in her pocket, but she no longer reached for it. That image belonged to another Margaret, one who had believed that love was possession, that marriage was a claim that could be enforced across any distance. This Margaret, sitting under the endless California sky, was beginning to understand that love might be something else entirely, something that set people free to choose their own happiness, even when that choice left others standing alone in the darkness, learning to find their own way to the light. Morning would come, and with it decisions that would shape the rest of her life. She could return to Missouri and the echoing farmhouse, could rebuild her existence around the comfortable certainties of the known world, or she could stay in this raw country where men and women reinvented themselves daily, where the old rules bent and sometimes broke under the weight of possibility. She could discover what Margaret Eliza Hartwell might become when she was no longer defined by her relation to anyone else, when she was simply herself, alone and unencumbered and free. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She pulled her shawl closer against the mountain cold and tilted her face toward the stars, feeling for the first time in months the stirring of something that might eventually become hope. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.